Okay. Hi, everyone. Today we are going to talk about the recently happened Iran-Israel conflict. I'm Jambo.
I'm Suval. Yeah, firstly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the historical background. Now, many of our audience, many members of our audience may think that historically speaking, Iran and Israel have always been at odds with each other, but that's not always been the case. Because before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Israel and Iran actually had decent ties. In 1950, Iran became the second country in the Muslim world to recognize Israel. However, after 1979 and the Islamic Revolution, Khomeini overthrew the Pahlavi dynasty, and the Islamic Republic labeled Israel Little Satin and cut off ties. The differences between their religions and ideologies are far and wide, making the two countries seemingly incompatible in modern times. In the 21st century, major flashpoints between the two have been Israel's nuclear ambitions, the fight for regional influence, among others, but most of the fighting has been in the form of proxy wars, with direct confrontation limited.
Okay, so let's talk about what actually happened during this conflict. Okay, so the key issue that caused the outbreak of the war is the militarization of Iranian nuclear technologies. Some might relate to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iranian nuclear deal, which was negotiated by former President Obama. The treaty was signed by six world powers, including the US, the UK, France, Germany, China, and Russia, along with Iran. This treaty has lifted economic sanctions imposed on Iran as long as it promised not to pursue nuclear weapons and allow UN inspections. However, in 2018, Trump withdrew from the treaty as he deemed the treaty was inadequate to stop Iran from developing and acquiring nuclear weapons, and he reimposed sweeping economic sanctions on Iran. And Iran subsequently decided to stop abiding by the rules anymore, also because of the assassination of a prominent military figure by the US. From then on, there hasn't been a functional deal stopping Iran from developing nuclear weapons anymore. Negotiations regarding the nuclear deal has restarted around 2020, but there hasn't been much progress since then. Because of geographical proximity, Iran has always held a radical stance on Iran's nuclear programs and seeing Iran only nuclear weapons as an existential crisis. With Israel anticipating Iranian nuclear bomb, Israel ordered a preemptive anticipatory self-defense, according to Israel, against Iran, striking military and civilian facilities in Tehran and downtown suburbs. Iran was outraged, and it retaliated by striking back facilities in and around Tel Aviv. As a staunch ally of Israel, the US awarded a 2-week ultimatum on Iran while sending B-2 stealth bombers and several submarines to strike Iranian nuclear facilities covertly. Allegedly, only US bombs were capable of striking the Iranian nuclear facilities. After the US strike, the war continued for several days before the US meditated a ceasefire deal.
So after that overcap of both this conflict and its historical background, now I'd like to talk more about the goals of relevant parties in this conflict, why they went into this conflict. First, I'd like to start with Israel, and as we can see on this slide, according to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, they had at least five goals. They wanted to strike Iran's nuclear enrichment program, nuclear weaponization program, main enrichment facility, its leading scientists, and also its ballistic missile program. But good policies, in my opinion, always have a multitude of goals, and Operation Rising Lion, which is the Israeli name for this attack, is no exception. Apart from obliteration of Iran's nuclear program, I think at heart, this operation is a continuation of Israel's previous attacks on Iran's proxies and interests in the Middle East. As we know, for quite some time now, Israel has been carrying out attacks and strikes on Iran's axis of resistance, namely Hezbollah in Lebanon and Yemen's Houthi rebels and so on. Israel has done so with the intent of weakening Iran and its allies increasing their regional influence as well as gauging Iran's response. When they saw that Iran's response was rather limited, their allies were weakened, Israel moved on and struck Iran itself, which is what we see today. So this operation's main goal, as stated by Prime Minister Netanyahu, was to dismantle Iran's nuclear program, its nuclear facilities, as well as its scientists, in order to ensure and safeguard Israel's national security. This is because, from Israel's point of view, if Iran does not have nuclear weapons or the capability to have them, it is not such a big threat or even much of a competitor to Israel. So, and it's clear that after this 12-day operation, at least some damage was done to the aforementioned targets. The extent is a matter of debate and discussion in the world today. There are, of course, other goals. For example, this strike can also be seen as the Begin Doctrine in action. The Begin Doctrine, named after former Israeli Prime Minister Begin, is a common term that the Israeli government uses for preventive strikes, especially against countries that may possess or have the ability to possess nuclear weapons. In this case, that would be Iran. So these are the obvious goals. There are also goals that aren't so obvious, that are not stated by the government, and simply some ideas that we would like to share and discuss here today. For example, another one of Israel's goals may be to test the international society and gauge their response to this strike, which is ill-justified by international law. Israel would like to see if more neutral countries would condemn their actions and if Iran's allies would lend a helping hand. As we can see, both were limited in this case. They also wanted to determine whether they would receive help and assistance from the US, and Israel should be rather pleased in this regard, as President Trump did indeed intervene. Apart from all of this, another likely goal is to divert the international society's attention from Gaza, as for some time now, the international society has been growing critical of Israel's actions in Gaza. After Israel started its strikes on Iran, we have seen that there has been less coverage on their actions in Gaza, yet the operation there has continued. So they have most likely also been rather successful in this regard. And another goal that they may have is regime change. It's been floated around, but it's a very difficult and complex topic that we can perhaps talk about a little later.
Yeah, so as I understand the goals of Israel, so it now may seem like Israel actually wanted like a more long-term war instead of like a brief conflict in order to like divert attention from Gaza and really like obliterate Iranian's nuclear program. So like was the Israel attack like actually stopped by Donald Trump, or like if Donald Trump did not intervene, like the war could still go on for like weeks and even months?
I think if President Trump didn't intervene, Israel and Iran would have definitely kept fighting, but I think Israel would have at one point come to a more substantial victory than it has come to in this conflict, because I think, personally speaking, I am of the view that Israel had the upper hand in the conflict against Iran when the ceasefire was mediated.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but so but why did the U.S. intervene, right? You might be wondering because, well, there are a few reasons. Now, many members of our audience may think that again, that President Trump's recent actions in intervening in Iran and Israel are not aligned with his campaign promises when he promised no more wars. Now, this is because many former US presidents, from Bush to Obama, have been caught up in the quagmire that is the Middle East, to the great dissatisfaction of the American people. They have been using American taxpayer dollars, losing American lives for something that has very little impact on the lives of daily Americans. So that's why Trump made this promise during his campaign, no more wars. But by now, I think we can see that, we're a few months into Trump's presidency. We can see that some, if not much, of his campaign promises of what he said on the campaign trail has stayed there. So I don't think it's that surprising that he's gone against his word slightly in this conflict. But putting aside that, reasons for the U.S. support in Israel are numerous. For one, supporting Israel has long been a consistent bipartisan policy of the US. And this shows its importance because very few issues are bipartisan in the United States, in the United States today. Bilateral ties between Israel and the United States have flourished ever since Israel's establishment as a country, and Israel is an important ally for the US in the Middle East, even characterized as America's aircraft carrier in the Middle East. In recent times, the US has also been generally supportive of Israel's actions, even in Gaza, at least initially. Another reason is that the US does not want Iran to have nuclear weapons either, and this has also been a long-standing and consistent policy of the US government. Hence, their intervention this time was scaled to this goal by only bombing 3 nuclear facilities. The extent of damage is debated, but undoubtedly there was at least some. This intervention also is also in line with the interests of America and those of President Trump. The U.S. and its armed forces showed strength this time by bombing Iran's 3 nuclear facilities, especially Fordow, a nuclear plant deep underground, something that allegedly only the U.S. armed forces could do, as Jambo mentioned before, while also sending a message to the world. No matter what country you are, you want to be on my side. Of course, this intervention also helped President Trump. Polls after this intervention showed that support for President Trump after the strikes increased across the political spectrum compared with before it. Support he needed with his approval ratings floundering and protests erupting all over the United States. He also attempted to show the American people, through this intervention, that he is both a strongman and a mediator who projects strength on the global stage to advance America's interests. There are also other goals, and now Jambo will take over from here.
Yeah, and I think like another factor at play might be Trump's personal ideology and beliefs, and from what we observed from his past actions during his first term and so on. Like Trump, I think, has been like extra harsh towards Iran, making sure that it does not get a bomb. Like a key in that manifesting this point is his withdrawal from Obama's Iranian nuclear deal. He claimed that the treaty was like too benign on Iran, so that the goal of actually obliterating the Iranian nuclear program cannot be achieved. Well, Trump, much like his predecessors, has also been very sympathetic towards Tel Aviv. For example, as you can see earlier in the year, he has accused Columbia and Harvard as anti-Semitic, forcing them to reorganize their Middle Eastern Studies department, starting the war against elite universities. Moreover, Trump has also mediated the Abraham's Accord, normalizing the Israeli diplomatic relationship with its Middle Eastern counterparts. This is also where Trump showed its pro-Israel stance. However, Trump's stance has also been somewhat ironic. Multiple editorials have partially blamed the Democrats' defeat in 2024 to their pro-Israel stance on Gaza. Some voters might have shifted to Republican because of Democrats' policy. This naturally begs the question that will Trump lose some support because of his stance on Middle East affairs? And I think this is actually a very complicated question because on the one side, you have those like angry voters who vows for less support for Israel. But on the other hand, you also have the Jewish lobby group who is against sanctions and condemnation against Israel. So it's actually put a lot of administration in dilemma.
Yes. So to conclude, I think that America's support for Israel is not surprising. While there are, of course, considerations that the US government has to consider, in the end, it is consistent US policy, and there is much in it for both the United States and President Trump. But there is one observation that I made that I found rather surprising, and that's after the ceasefire, when the two sides accused each other of violating it, and they seemed to be spiraling into further conflict. Trump criticized not only Iran, but also Israel, and was even, to my great surprise, harsher on Israel. I think perhaps this shows that US support for Israel, especially under President Trump, is not as unwavering as previously thought. Because in this case, if the two sides had continued to fight, blatantly violating a US brokered, and more importantly, a Trump brokered ceasefire, it would have had adverse effects on Trump's global image as a strong yet peace-loving leader that he has striven to create. Hence, he had to respond strongly to prevent that from happening. It seems that for Trump, everything and everybody else, be it allies or not, be it other countries' interests or not, be it traditions or not, they all pale in comparison with his own personal interests. So whether this trend will continue, whether US support for traditional allies will continue to be steadfast, these are also questions that merit further observation and discussion in this second Trump term.
Yeah. So after a deadly conflict, we would always wonder what was the outcome. And more specifically, in this case, we want to answer the question of what was the impact of the US strikes on Iran. This actually has been a quite a contentious topic around the world with multiple perspectives. And to answer the question, we also have to figure out the following. First, did Iran transfer its enriched uranium and facilities before the strike? And secondly, how powerful was the US bunker busting bomb? And last, how were Iranian research capabilities after the strike? All of them were yet to be answered. So the impact of the US strike is also quite nebulous by now. There has, as I mentioned before, multitude of different interpretations regarding the extent of damage the strike has caused. First, we can see, according to the Trump administration, Trump said in press conferences that he obliterated Iranian nuclear facilities, indicating that Iranian nuclear capabilities was impossible to recover in the short term or even in the long term. The Israeli government basically agreed with such statements, with Netanyahu claiming to have scored historic victory. However, US intelligence agencies, on the other hand, suggested otherwise. It claimed that Iranian facilities has been severely damaged, the subtext of which being that the damage was repairable, which contradicts with Trump. Another interpretation came from the international media, including outlets such as BBC and CNN, who stated that the attack had limited effect, only delaying Iran by a few months. Well, although words such as severe damage and a few months could seem similar, but on the extent of a nuclear program and when it's on the negotiation table, this can actually make a huge difference. And last, Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei claimed that there was no significant damage, presumably to state Iranians. For casualties, Israel suffered from 229 deaths and 2,328 injuries, while 610 Iranians died in the deadly conflict, with another 4,746 injured. However, it should be noted that casualty numbers could fluctuate a bit according to your source. Okay, so these are the satellite images of the nuclear facilities that was struck by the US, just as reference.
So yeah, as we can see, claims vary, and many sides have claimed different things. So what do we think of the conflict? Right? This is a very complicated question, and different perspectives yield different answers. In my opinion, I think Israel won big because with the assistance of the US, Israel struck and damaged Iran's nuclear facilities to a decent extent. I think that we can say, because while perhaps falling short of complete obliteration, as touted by President Trump, the general director of the IAEA, which is an international organization, Rafael Grossi, said that the facilities in Iran suffered severe damage, not total damage, but still severe damage. And I think that's quite a decent amount of damage. In addition to the sites, Israel also targeted many nuclear scientists and important figures and military leaders in Iran, all of which are big losses for Iran. So apart from the damage that they caused, I think another important victory for Israel is that while this operation was ill-justified under international law and little provoked by Iran, nobody, almost nobody in the international society helped Iran. Criticism was also limited, and Israel received support from the United States. The fact that Israel was able to inflict such damage with few losses and little condemnation is a great victory, in my opinion, and it will only embolden Israel to further its strikes on Iran, and in extension all of its enemies and the countries and entities that they are at odds with, while they also showcase their military at the same time. Another victory for Israel is that Iran's regime has been weakened, with its leaders seemingly at the mercy of Israel. In this conflict, many top leaders were assassinated, and the supreme leader is alive, perhaps only because of Trump's veto. With the leaders of Iran fearing for their lives and the regime clinging on only barely, it is likely that Iran's development will be impeded as the current theocratic regime tries harder than ever before to stay in power. On the other side, the picture is much grimmer for Iran, which was Israel's adversary in this conflict. It was attacked, it received little support from the international society, its facilities and people were hit and targeted and hit alike. They were unable to hit back with fire against Israel, and they did not dare reciprocate with the US. On paper, they struck the US military base in Qatar, but in reality, they informed them in advance. So whether it's militarily or from other viewpoints, the picture is very grim for Iran in my view. Perhaps the only victories for Iran are that they showed that Israel's Iron Dome is not invincible. As long as you fire a sufficient amount of rockets at the same time, it will become saturated, and some rockets will inevitably enter Israel and be able to hit Israeli mainland. And also that this conflict has united the Iranian people, which means that regime change is unlikely to happen in the short run. But whether this is a good thing or a bad thing for multiple parties involved is also a matter worth discussing. Jambo.
Yeah. From my side, I think that Israeli gains were modest while Iran was not completely defeated. Well, we can see the main goal of this operation was to completely destroy Iranian nuclear program, but this obviously did not happen, even if it was severely damaged. According to the head of IAEA, Iran may be able to restart uranium enrichment in a matter of months. At the same time, whether or not the US, especially under the Trump administration, will continue to support Israel is in question. President Trump is likely unwilling to see the ceasefire brokered by him fall apart, previously saying that he expects the deal to last forever. Unwelcome side effect of this conflict for Israel is that the Iranian people are more united, as mentioned before. As was the case in Iran-Iraq war during the 80s, when Iran is faced with a common enemy, and it becomes more united with less opposition, either of their own accord or through cleansings by the regime. As such enemies afford them the opportunity to crack down on dissidents under the guise of patriotism. With a more united people, no matter who is in power, whether it be the current regime or a democratically elected government, it will be easier to stimulate Iran's development and lead it to a brighter future. But I think the essence of this conflict is still that to what extent was the nuclear facilities damaged or even destroyed?
Yes, to what extent they were destroyed, and also what the lesson that Iran will take from this is. Will these strikes steadfast their will to create nuclear weapons, as they think that none of this would have happened if they would have had nuclear weapons, or will they think that it is not worth continuing their production of a nuclear weapon, as it is not worth being struck like this time and time again?
Um, I think that there are definitely like both of the two perspectives in Iran. I've like read reports of like Iranian nuclear experts saying that it was not worth the risk of developing nuclear weapons if they were continuing to become destroyed by Israel and US. But however, like some of the more like nationalist Iranians might think that they would better acquire the nuclear bomb so that they would not be struck yet. But at the end of the day, which perspective does the Iranian president and its supreme leader adopts, I think we cannot predict at this time.
Mm. But I think the supreme leader is rather he's nationalistic, and so he may want nuclear weapons. But at the same
Yeah.
time, um, yeah, as I mentioned, I really do think that the Iranian leadership right now is kind of paralyzed in some ways because Israel has shown that it has the ability to get to and assassinate Iranian leaders seemingly at their will and very easily, as we saw at the start of this conflict. So I think if the leaders of Iran are fearing for their lives, then they may be more inclined to negotiate and to tone down their rhetoric and also not acquire a nuclear weapon. But yeah, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, like although Iran do have a president and it's a liberal president, but I don't think like, but he actually wields much power, and I think the final call is definitely made by the more conservative and theocratic supreme leader.
Yeah.
Okay, so we also want to talk about the US states because it is a key player in the conflict. In the United States, we have seen a considerable amount of domestic opposition. The chart below illustrates this situation well. We can see that before the attack, the majority of US citizens disapproved Trump's action to strike Iran, especially by Democrats and independents. And after the war, um, the things have shifted, and with a majority of US citizens approving Trump's action. Uh, However, like even before the strike, if the overall support rate is compared with Trump's administration's overall support rate, it's actually not that bad for him. One of the key reasons for the initial lack of support can be attributed to the fact that Americans don't want they and their country to be embroiled in another deadly, costly, and lethal Middle Eastern conflict anymore, like the Iraq or the Afghanistan crisis. The Americans were still haunted by their involvement there. After the strike, however, support rose. Why? I think presumably because the population knew that the Iranian conflict would not turn into a second Iraq war, and also because of the strength that the President Trump and the U.S. military showcased in their historic attack. However, to say this chart can well illustrate Trump's actions, support rate is still a bit of inaccurate. The poll, I think, to a certain extent, is also Trump's approvability ratings. Republicans show extremely high support for intervention. However, I don't think that Republicans are inherently hawkish or that they support their strike. In fact, I don't think Republicans would have such high support rating if Joe Biden or Kamala Harris was the commander-in-chief. After all, Trump has
Yeah.
campaigned on an anti-war platform during the presidential election of 2024. I think their support can be more attributed to their support for Donald Trump as a leader rather than their individual policies or actions. On the other hand, Democrats' dissatisfaction also mainly stems from their dissatisfaction for Trump. Democrats, as we can see from previous administrations, aren't that pro-peace either. The opposition of Trump's action involves two key areas. For the protesting mass, is pretty much avoiding another costly war. But for media outlets and congressmen and congresswomen, the problem of constitutionality also comes into play. The idea of separation of power in the United States Constitution delegates power of declaration of war solely to the Congress, while the president remains the commander-in-chief of the army. In other words, the president is struck by the Congress. This has sparked a whole series of debate regarding the definition of the declaration of war. Was Trump's action classified as a special military operation or war? This debate has been key importance after World War II, since both the Vietnam War and the War on Terror lacked explicit consent from the Congress, with media and the population questioning their actions' constitutionality. So, during the Vietnam War, the Congress decided to roll back presidential war power by passing a bill called the War Powers Resolution, as you can see on the slide. The War Powers Resolution intends to restrain presidential power. The president can only deploy the army for a maximum of 60 days without congressional consent, with another 30 days for withdrawal. However, it also, in my opinion, formalized an unwritten practice. The president, in fact, has the power to deploy the army without congressional approval for a limited amount of time. However, this bill also has its problem that even if the president disobeys the Congress can still do little to the president since he is the commander-in-chief. So thus, I don't think Trump's administration's actions has actually violated the Constitution, since a short-term conflict without consent from Congress is actually allowed.
Mm.
Moreover, a key concept in modern warfare is secrecy. If any military action has to be preceded by a vote in the Congress, such secrecies will undoubtedly be compromised. Additionally, it wasn't rare for presidents to be accused of being unconstitutional. From George W.H. Bush to Obama and previous decisions of Trump, the opposition has been constantly accusing the incumbent of being unconstitutional. It has almost become a routine. Also, besides the problem of constitutionality, we also would like to talk about the media, which also played a significant role. As you can see in the slide, we had a headline, which is from a New York Post, as Trump threatens to sue New York Times and CNN over reports undermining Iranian strike claims. Trump actually said they underestimated the extent of damage at the nuclear facilities. I think besides this story can reflect that the fact that the extent of damage of the Iranian nuclear strike was yet unknown, and it can also reflect and aligns with Trump's previous moves of accusing left-leaning press, which undermines Trump's credibility as fake news. However, I do think such behavior is detrimental to the United States in the long term. If the president is constantly attacking the media, the people will lose their trust in traditional media sources. Then they might find a hard time to obtain information, which is absolutely necessary when they are making decisions regarding which candidate to vote on elections. And if people don't trust traditional medias, whom should they trust? Like Twitter posts, I don't think it's much better source. If the people's decision regarding who they vote is based on factual information, then those who are elected based on the distorted information may not represent the nation and the people's interest well either.
Yeah, I don't think Trump uses Twitter much now. I think he uses Truth Social for most of his posts. But yeah.
Yeah, but like
it's it's the same. So after the United States, I think another interesting player and topic for discussion in this conflict is Qatar and its role as a mediator. Apart from President Trump in the United States, Qatar also played an important role in the ceasefire talks in this conflict, and many other conflicts also seem to be mediated by Qatar. So why is it that such a small country has such a important role on the world stage, and especially in the realm of mediation? For one, Qatar is neutral and it has balanced relationships with all relevant parties. Unlike other countries in the Middle East, for example, the UAE, which is quite similar to Qatar, as at least when you look at it from an outsider's perspective, Qatar differs from the UAE in the fact that it not only has decent relations with the West and Israel, but it also has healthy dialogue with countries like Iran and organizations like the Taliban and Hamas. This dialogue with all relevant parties helps garner trust and bring parties to the table, which is, of course, very important when you are mediating a conflict. You need everyone there, right? Other reasons also exist. For example, Qatar's past successes. when you succeed in the past, people are more likely to trust you to mediate their conflicts now. And examples of Qatari successes abound. For example, they brokered the U.S. Taliban deal. They brokered the Darfur civil war. The list goes on and on. All of these successful examples further their credentials as a capable and successful mediator, and it creates a positive feedback, as scientists, I think, would say. Another reason is their wealth. While money and resources did not play an important role in this resolution, in other conflicts, such as the aforementioned Darfur ceasefire, their wealth was used as an incentive for peace and dialogue, and ultimately played an important role in its success. Apart from this, and I think the reasons I mentioned above, especially the one where it is neutral and has balanced relationships and healthy dialogue with all relevant parties, that is the basic and the most crucial reason why it is a very successful mediator in the world today. Also, it is also a part of national strategy, this mediation. Mediation has been institutionalized in Qatar, with conflict resolution seen as an important part of diplomacy, even being written into the constitution, with Article 7 of Qatar's constitution stipulating peaceful resolution as a key principle of foreign policy. Apart from this, another important factor we should consider is that Qatar's willingness to take risks and make sacrifices has also been key to its success as a mediator. For example, in this conflict, when Iran struck the military base, the U.S. military base in Qatar, it was a great violation of Qatar's sovereignty. But Qatar's response was limited, partly because of its image as a mediator and because of the necessity for it to maintain good ties with all relevant parties. It also runs other risks of compromising that may compromise national security, as it houses the leaders of, in some cases, not so peaceful organizations. For example, it hosts the political office of the Taliban and the political bureau of Hamas. And these are all things that may cause insecurity inside Qatar and may, to an extent, compromise and endanger its national security and its people and so on. So if such risks exist, why would Qatar be willing to make these sacrifices? Well, there are many reasons, and the first of them is that Qatar also wants peace in the Middle East and is willing to do its part in achieving this. Peace and stability in the Middle East is undoubtedly beneficial to Qatar's national security, economy, and national development, and is hence a major motive. Apart from peace at large, Qatar also plays such a role to advance its own interests. By being a mediator, Qatar is able to play an important role on the world stage as a small country and hit above its weight, widening its influence and creating a stable image which will then attract foreign investment, boost their economy, improve their soft power, stimulate development, and even to an extent safeguard Qatar's national security. Apart from attracting foreign funds and expats, as is well documented through their stability and prosperity, Qatar has also developed its soft power through mediation. After years of mediating conflicts, Qatar has developed a decent amount of expertise and experience in this realm, and hence hosts globally important conferences such as the Doha Forum and also world-class foreign policy and diplomatic universities such as Georgetown University in Qatar, etc., all of which undoubtedly help Qatar's cultural development and its development as a nation as a whole. Another goal that Qatar has, or another thing that Qatar may want to do, is safeguard its national security through its diplomacy by following the logic that the more friends it has, the more countries that will be able to help in times of difficulty. A counter-argument to this, however, would be that Qatar may also be seen as a wallflower, which would have the opposite effect, and countries may be less willing to help them as they are seen as a wallflower. Another reason, and the final reason I would like to discuss today, is that they may also have religious and moral motivations, and also they may feel the responsibility to do so, as it is stated in the Quran, which is the holy text of Islam, that if two groups of Muslims fight against each other, reconcile them. Qatari officials have made it clear that the moral and religious compulsion of the former emir to act as a regional peacemaker contributed to the emergence of mediation as a major conflict of foreign policy. This is according to a paper on Qatar's mediation, and so it's very likely that religion and has also played an important role in Qatar's mediation, and it is a reason why Qatar has decided to take the risks and play their role as a mediator in, of course, combination with the reasons I mentioned before.
Yeah, so I think actually Qatar's role as a mediator is can no longer be viewed just as a foreign policy. I think it's also part of its domestic policy, like UAE's policy to build like a lot of towers and resorts to attract tourism. I think like Qatar's role as a mediator is also a way to end its over reliance on oil to like attract international corporations and especially international conferences and international institutions to headquarter in Qatar. And
Yeah, so undoubtedly, it's a very important part of Qatari strategy in the world in the modern day. Yes, so shall we move on?
sure. So this is actually the last part, and we want to look ahead and see the possible outcomes of the event. Okay, so the first question is, will war break out again? I think yes, there is definitely the possibility that the war will resume. If Israel has no tolerance for an Iranian nuclear bomb and the Iranian nuclear negotiations fail to meet the expectation of Israel, then Israel will launch a war no matter what, which will make the Middle East landscape even more chaotic. Israel has always had radical military plans regarding Iran. Israel allegedly planned to assassinate an Iranian supreme leader, but was vetoed by Donald Trump, as mentioned earlier. Besides, after the ceasefire deal, Israel did not stop its missiles, indicating the inclination to continue the war efforts. Although Trump criticized Khamenei's speech regarding Iranian victory, Trump was nevertheless somewhat still a pro-peace figure, no matter for the peace of the Middle East or his own interests. He wants peace in the Middle East, that's all. Admittedly, we should not rule out the possibility that Trump was enraged by Iranian supreme leader's speech and decided not to stop Israel anymore. But the question still exists that even without United States support, I think Israel might still strike Iran again if Iran was to acquire a nuclear bomb.
Yeah, I think that the Middle East is such that, especially between, especially the two countries of Iran and Israel, their relations are, I would say, beyond repair. The anonymity between the two countries has been present ever since the Islamic Republic's establishment in 1979. So conflict is inevitable between the two countries, in my opinion, but it's only a matter of when, not if. Will it happen again in a few days, a few weeks, a few months, or a few years? That's the question here at hand. And I think that this conflict, it stopped only because of President Trump's mediation. And yes, as Jumbo mentioned, Trump has been seen as or at least is at least now a pro-peace figure in this discussion. So, if Trump continues to want peace, Israel may not risk going against Trump and striking Israel in Trump's term. But so I think that if Trump continues to want peace, conflict may not break out again at least in the next few years before Trump leaves office. But if Trump, as Jumbo mentioned at the end there, was enraged by Khamenei's speech and decided not to stop Israel, I think that Israel would be more than willing to start fighting and start exchanging, missiles with Iran again, because Israel, I think, has the upper hand in any armed conflict with almost any country in the Middle East. And in this case, as we've seen, they certainly do have the upper hand against Iran. And if they have American support, that's great. If they don't, they may have to think twice, because especially Prime Minister Netanyahu, because I read a piece the other day that says that it is also in Netanyahu's political interests, not to be at odds with President Trump, because the Israeli people know that President Trump's support or the United States support is very important. So I think that if President Trump is pro-peace and does not want to go into another war, then Netanyahu and Israel, the Israeli government, may be more careful, and they may not they may not start war again. But if Trump does not stop them, then I think it is quite likely that we will see another conflict in perhaps not weeks, but perhaps months and perhaps months. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the problem here is that how Israel its priorities. On the one hand, Israel has the priority of maintaining a good relationship with the US and especially the Trump, so not to like violate the peace deal. But on the other hand, it also has a priority of destroying the Iranian nuclear capabilities.
Yeah.
I doubt like Israel have the patience to wait for years, which will definitely give Iran enough time to build a nuclear bomb if the negotiations fell apart, even if the facilities were severely damaged. So I doubt that Israel can wait like for a few years after that Trump has left office and then strike Iran. Uh, Personally, I think for Israel, it might list the priority of destroying Iran capabilities above maintaining a good relationships with Trump. And because besides, even if it did, like say, strike Iran, we still have those Jewish lobby groups back in Washington, like to potentially like sway Trump's idea, though they might not succeed. Yeah.
Yeah, now I do agree that I think Israel does put um destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities and safeguarding its national security above uh having great relations, or it is fine to risk the wrath, I guess, of Trump in order to safeguard its national security. Yeah, so I think okay, so if we put it this way, then conflict may break out rather soon, but I don't. Yeah,
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think we also have to like see how the nuclear talks go. Yeah.
yeah, and also to what extent they were damaged, which is our second question on the agenda. Because I think if they were damaged to a rather severe extent, then Israel doesn't have to strike in immediate future. But if they were not damaged that greatly, if Iran can, get back to where it was a few months ago in a few months, then perhaps Israel may have to think about further action to continue to damage is Iran's nuclear program and its facilities.
Yeah, I think, yeah, but the main problem is that we do not have a lot of information regarding the extent to which the nuclear facilities are damaged. But like,
Yeah.
it's really like, uh, keep bombing Iranian nuclear facilities wasn't the sort of the best long-term foreign policy that Israel can come up with. So I think negotiation is also essential. I think what Israel might want is another like precision strike, and those attack and surprise attack that can be like executed within days, and to like basically solve the problem for the long term. But I also don't think that Israel has the military capabilities to do that.
Hmm. Yeah. So, shall we now move on to the third question? I think we're on the third question.
Yeah, so the third question is, what was the war's impact on the future nuclear talks? Specifically, we want to discuss whether talks have made Iran more prone to compromise on nuclear issues, or will Iran adopt a more hardliner stance? We believe that due to its comparatively weak military forces, Iran can't afford to adopt a hardliner stance. Nevertheless, we also believe that such a strike has made Iran more determined to acquire its new nuclear weapons. After all, if Iran did possess nuclear weapons, Israel would no longer dare to bomb it. In terms of negotiation, BBC reported the Iranian foreign minister claimed the negotiation is viable on the premise that the attack has to stop. From an Iranian perspective, negotiation bought Iran time to pursue a nuclear bomb while negotiation in process. Although building bombs secretly when the negotiation is in progress can lead to further strikes on Iranian soil. We believe that Iranian strategy mainly lies on the extent to which its facilities are really damaged. If nuclear weapons are obtainable in the short term, they might choose to gamble and acquire the bomb. However, if damage was extremely severe, adding years to the development schedule, Iran may basically have no alternative but to negotiate and compromise. Nevertheless, all of the above analysis was based on the premise that Iran has a nuclear plan and still wish to advance its plans amid attacks, which media don't have a consensus either.
Yeah, so it really depends on the extent of the damage and also whether or not Iran is willing to take the risk, and also which factions in Iran, end up coming out successful. Is it the hardliners or is it the ones that are perhaps more objective and agree to negotiations? Which I think if the extent of damage is severe, then I think negotiations are the best way forward because they simply don't have another choice, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, the fourth question. I think this is a pretty tricky one, because it's tied to how to ensure stability and peace in the Middle East, and to a great extent. As we can see, the Middle East has been especially volatile in recent years, mainly because of the animosity of various Muslim countries and the Jewish state of Israel. Despite Israel being surrounded and outnumbered by its Arabic counterparts, it has a modern and vast military. Or still, some of the Arabic states practice religious fundamentalist theocracy. From a liberal viewpoint, a good Middle Eastern policy of the United States should mediate the ethnic religious divisions, promote stable and democratic institutions, and ensure the cheap supply of crude oil. The Middle Eastern problem has been a chronic problem, and we certainly do not aim to solve it with a few commentaries. Conflict in the Middle East can be largely attributed to a conflict of interest, especially in terms of national security. The first solution is regime change within one or more of the Middle Eastern countries. This is unrealistic, however, since Muslims in the Middle East are quite devoted to their faith and have no idea what democracy is. Even the war on terror, which was also based on the principle of regime change towards democracy, with the backing of the US Army, failed spectacularly. Another scenario is where there are two antagonistic powers with similar strengths, like the case in the Cold War. With mutually assured destruction, also known as MAD, no one dared to attack another in fear of potential consequences. Even if there were conflicts, it would be constrained to regional conflicts rather than total wars. Since it is unrealistic for Israel to denuclearize unilaterally, to achieve this scenario, Iran will have to acquire nuclear capabilities. Although this might stabilize the Middle Eastern landscape to a certain extent, it might pose a threat to other countries in the world, since this might encourage fundamentalist terrorist groups. If they are based in a nuclear-armed Iran, there's practically no way the US or other countries could intervene easily. The potential atrocities caused by those terrorist groups is simply insane. The last situation is where a single dominant force stands out. If the dominant force can get whatever it wants without consequences, there is no need for war. It was extremely likely that we are heading towards this situation as the growth of Israeli strength far outpaces its Arabic counterparts. When no other country dared to attack him, war would simply cease to exist, as Israel remains safe and prosperous in the Middle East. This situation, however, still faces the problem of terrorist attacks. Although formal wars might be avoided, terrorism or even state-sponsored violence might increase under such circumstances. It was the only way the Arabic countries could fight back. In terms of casualties and inhumanities, such attacks were no better than outright wars. It might not just be Israel. The whole Western world might be overwhelmed by the fear of such attacks. Although Israel have some of very advanced anti-terrorist measures, they even build border wall across the West Bank, but I still think that they have a lot of strategies and they could adapt to the Israel defense matters, and I don't think that they could be prevented outright.
Yeah, I think the main thing with terrorists is that they are willing to do anything to inflict damage, and it's difficult to fight enemies that want to do that, especially when they could be happening anytime. But yeah, I do agree that the last situation is most likely to happen because right now there's not really a country in the Middle East that I think has capabilities that can rival Israel. And uh, Iran is, I would say, Israel's largest adversary in the Middle East. And this conflict has shown that its at least its military capabilities are not on par with Israel. They cannot fight Israel in a military and an armed conflict. So yeah, I think the third situation might be something we're going toward, and I would say that it's not exactly great news for the Middle East because, as mentioned, terrorist attacks, especially terrorism, may be on the rise, especially in countries that are already rather volatile. And yeah, so the Middle East, the conflict in the Middle East is a chronic problem, and yeah, it's very difficult to solve. Oh.
Yeah, I think like even terrorist attacks were prevented. The cost of Israeli people are also like quite huge. And because I once seen an article about the Israeli airlines, and they said like everyone was questioned like in a small room on whether they are terrorists or not before boarding the plane for like 20 or 30 minutes, and their baggages were all double checked. And yeah, I think that's like in American terms is basically kind of like infringing civil rights and civil liberties. Yeah. So even if there are no terrorist attack, I think it will also be quite a cost to the living standards of Israeli people.
Hmm.
Okay, let's move on. The fifth question is: will Israel continue to attack other countries? We believe that the number one target of Israel in the Middle East is Iran, which has been to some extent paralyzed after this attack. From Hillabest to the Houthis and Hamas, the Iranian axis of resistance has been almost destroyed by Israel. In the Middle East, all Israeli potential targets have been struck, with little targets left for Israel to further attack. However, if any country deliberately fights back Israel, Israel will definitely retaliate against them. Even if Israel intends to strike other countries, it might meet increased resistance. Because of the Iranian nuclear problem, not many countries have criticized Israel and backed Iran. But if it were to attack other countries, not those terrorist groups, will international protests increase? We deem it very likely. In the long term, even U.S. support for Israel is a variable. The U.S. expected to be a strong ally of Israel in the short term. However, with the public perception of Israel falling sharply, will U.S. politicians eventually shift their stance due to public demands? Will military and economic ties continue? Moreover, the strategic importance of Israel has also been decreasing. With a plethora of U.S. military bases opening in the Middle East, that the U.S. still needs Israel as a tier one ally.
Yeah, a question that I've always had regarding Israel is that I've always wondered is expansionism a part of Israeli policy? Because over the years it's been gradually expanding, like in Gaza, and not in Gaza, but like it's been gradually taking over Palestinian land, according at least to the, I think, 1947, the resolution by the UN. It's been gradually taking over land in Palestine, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. Not really in Gaza, but yeah, it's been taking over land gradually. So I've always wondered, is expansionism a part of Israeli policy? Because I mean, I think perhaps because in the past, I don't think it was always the case because they gained a lot of land. For example, I don't remember whether it was the Six-Day Conflict or the Yom Kippur War, but in a conflict in the past, they gained the Sinai Peninsula from from from
Egypt.
Egypt. Yes, but they gave it back in the Camp David Accords, I believe it was. So I think in the past, perhaps it wasn't really expansionism wasn't really part of their policy, but in recent times, especially under Benjamin Netanyahu, perhaps it is. So I did a slight Google search like a few seconds ago, and Google's AI overview tells me that while Israel's official policy does not explicitly state expansionism as a goal, settlement expansion in the West Bank and other occupied territories is widely viewed as a form of expansionism. So, yeah, I'm just interested in whether Israel has this as a policy or as a goal, because if it does, then it will definitely attack other countries to advance its interests. But if it doesn't, then perhaps it will only strike its adversaries. For example, in this case, Iran and the other various organizations such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and you know, yeah, other organizations.
Yeah. So like uh for the first place, Netanyahu has also often been characterized as a right wing to a far right politician, even in Israel. So I definitely think there's the ideology of nationalism, and some even said uh, Netanyahu is turning Israel into a theocratic state. So with the nationalism, I think we can expect expansionism. And because like I'm not really sure, but I don't think Netanyahu or other like right-winger prime minister was in charge of Israel during the Camp David Accord, because for previous centrist prime ministers, both like acknowledged less radical approach towards the Middle Eastern countries, but Netanyahu is a right-winger politician might be more towards animosity and antagonism towards them. And in terms of the settlements in West Bank and Jerusalem, I think there's definitely expansionism going on. And I also think there is a practical need of like building settlements in there, because like Israeli population has been like exploding and is necessary, but I don't does not mean like it's justified. It's up to you to judge that they have to build other settlements, perhaps outside their recognized territory, in order to accommodate the rising population.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's understandable that they want land, they want more land, because Israel is even now still a small country, but they're still taking land away from Palestine. That's not exactly a good thing. Yeah, about Benjamin Netanyahu, I don't know if he like when he came to power, like I think a decade or a long time ago, was he already right wing then, or has he become increasingly right wing in recent times? One in part because of course rising tensions with other entities, and also because of his need for his own political survival inside Israel. Because a few years ago things weren't looking that good for Netanyahu, and I think to form his recent coalition governments, he's needed the support of right-wing nationalist, sometimes extreme parties inside Israel, uh, for support. So is he like right-wing himself, or is it because he needs the support of right-wing factions to survive that his policies are increasingly right-wing and expansionist?
Yeah,
That's
I don't know much about Netanyahu, but I've seen on his wiki page that he has been the longest serving Israeli prime minister, but like
yeah.
his term was like separated. He first became prime minister, I think, in the 90s, and went to opposition and went back and forth as prime minister and leader of opposition. So it's
Mm,
basically a very convoluted history. And I
yeah.
think I'm not sure about Netanyahu's policies back in like the 20th century, but I'm pretty sure that into 21st century, when Netanyahu was the prime minister, he has basically adopted a quite right-wing policies that emphasize on Israel. And as you can
Mm,
see in the polls in Israel, even with uh, like those right-wing policies were regarded by outsiders, he still enjoys sweeping like support from Israeli people. Yeah.
yeah. I think it's long been said that a key factor in Netanyahu's survival in Israeli politics is that he is strong and he safeguards Israel's national security.
Yeah, Netanyahu has definitely like portrayed himself like a a militarily strong man that the population could rely on.
Yeah. Okay.
Look at the sixth question. Will it be a good thing for the regime change to happen in Iran? Okay, so for the first place, we believe that regime change is not a primary goal of this attack. It sounds more like a long-term plan, or presumably just for bluffing by Donald Trump. If the US were to pursue and Israel were to pursue regime change, a lot more was needed from simply launching missiles. Army would have to march into Iranian territory, presumably into the heavily guarded Tehran. The military strength that required and the commentations that might ensue on the international stage was simply not comparable to this attack. Moreover, a regime change would cause much chaos and instability in the Middle East, which is against Trump's interest. It thus remains nebulous whether he will really support regime change. In terms of regime change, we are mainly talking about turning Iran from a semi-theocratic state into a fully democratic country. However, empirical evidence has demonstrated that even democratization was initiated by external factors or by elites above. It is very likely it will slide back to authoritarian or liberal democracies, while democratization efforts led by the masses are more likely to succeed, as we can also see from the failure of the Iraq and Afghanistan. And this begs the question of how to make sure an Iraq-style failure not to be recreated. Even if Iran did become a democracy, I don't think the government might be like adopting a pro-Israel or pro-US stance based on the political socialization of current Iranians.
Yeah, I think being anti-Israel is something that is I don't want to say in the blood, but certainly a tradition of Iran and many of its allies. Yeah, I think the ideal situation, of course, for if we're talking from Israel and the US's standpoint, is that regime change does happen and a pro-Israel, pro-American player comes into rule. It's democratic, they're good friends, they're on good terms and etc. But that's like basically impossible. I don't think that's happening anytime soon. Um, and yeah, if regime changes happen, it may be democratic, it may not be democratic. If it's democratic, I think Israel runs the risk of like a democratic and united Iran, I think, is a much stronger adversary to Israel than the current weakened and theocratic government. What am I saying? So I think if Iran were to become democratic, it would become and united, it would become much more of a stronger adversary to Israel than it is today. Because I think the current political system of Iran, it to an extent impedes Iranian development because the people are not completely united with the government. They are not completely united in their mission to make Iran stronger and more prosperous because they are also at odds in many cases with the current Iranian government's policies and the regime's policies, and that always impedes development of a country, in my opinion. Yeah, so I think perhaps the current state is actually very ideal for Israel because the current Iranian regime it has been weakened. It is, as I mentioned before, I personally think that Iran's leaders are at the mercy of Israel. So with these two factors and of course others, Iran's regime and its current government is, I would say, simply unable to lead Iran toward development and prosperity, at least now. And if that's the case, then Israel has nothing to be afraid of. Iran will no longer be a strong adversary of Israel. So I think honestly, if the ideal situation is impossible, which I do think it is, then I think the current situation of a weakened Iranian theocratic regime is actually ideal for Israel. So it may not want further regime change if regime change is deemed to be very unpredictable. Because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right now, it's not that bad. Israel has the upper hand, and I think it will have the upper hand for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think like the plan of Israel is basically that when Iran have a democratically elected government, they'll like stop pursuing their development for a nuclear bomb due to public protest. But I'm not sure about that. And I think Israel is also counting that because on the first few years of democratization, like there could be much chaos both in terms of socially and economically when there is like fast political transformations, and this could potentially like weaken Iran in the short term. And I'm also thinking about like if it was a democratically elected government, maybe like Israel might try to like sabotage, like to instigate like rebellions within the Iranian territories, or maybe like try to influence elections to their favor in terms of in Iran. Yeah.
Yeah, I think is Iran will always at heart be somewhat anti-Israel, at least for the foreseeable future, because I mean they've been at odds with each other for 50 years. I don't think it's like governments can come and go, but um things that are ingrained into society stay there. And I think being anti-Israel is something that has been ingrained into Iranian society in the past 50 years or so that the current regime has been in power. So yeah, I think that I think Israel also realizes and recognizes that they're not going to get a pro-Israeli Iranian government anytime soon. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess that's all of our content for this podcast, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.